Hey guys, what is up? It is Kristen, and today I have a video for you on how to put together vectors in C++. I specifically wanted to address how to use vectors with objects, so I'm going to show you how to implement vectors that way. Okay, so the first thing I want to go over is what is a vector? Well, a vector is very similar to an array. But the difference is that you don't have to specify the size for a vector because it can dynamically reallocate its own size. So the first thing to implement a vector, you need to make sure that you are including your include vector at the top of your program. You'll notice here that I'm using a different data structure type called a struct. This is a primitive, or I wouldn't say a primitive, but it's an earlier predecessor of classes and objects. The general thing you want to know here is that this contains variables, but no class public functions. So you can have objects with data members in them, but this is just loosely put together. So it's just a simpler version of a class. And we're going to use that for our objects. Okay, so the first thing I want to go over here is a couple of common vector commands that you will come across when looking to put together a program with vectors in C++. I've listed a couple of them here for you to use and specified what they do. So let's jump into how to actually implement these. The first thing I want you to notice is that this is how I have declared my vector. I'm taking a vector, you're specifying vector, it is going to be a vector, and then you're going to specify the type of the vector. And because we have a struct of type people, so this is our class name, quote unquote, and here we have the actual name of the vector itself that we're creating. Here I am creating an instance of the struct in my main. So this is just like creating an instance of a class object. Here we're saying people, which is the struct, and we're naming the object students. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to parse up a txt file. And this txt file contains names of students and their grades for an exam. So just like before with other assignments, we have to do file IO. So that means opening a file stream, making sure that you're parsing the txt file correctly. So that means I've implemented a split function as well in this program. You could also use string stream if you know how to use the operations for string stream. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a couple of the commands that I just specified above to implement and manipulate the objects in our vector. So what I've done here is after calling my split function, I have the names and the scores of each student stored into a temporary array and then converted into variables that are easy to read. I'm also setting a third variable whether the student score on either line of the file is greater than 70. So I'm going to have a Boolean value attached to each person that's going to be a pass or fail score. And you can see here I'm using a similar operation to assigning the information to private members of a class object. I'm saying the object students that I created, .name, which is its private variable, is going to be equal to the student names, it's the incoming data from our txt file. The same thing happens here with the score and with the Boolean value that's a private member of students. So this is an important line to note. This is how we actually add in an object or an element into a vector. We specify the vector name, then use the dot operator, and we call the pushback function, which is part of the include vector library. And we're going to pass it an object, which is students. Everything that just got assigned to students is now correctly updated at this point because we've assigned everything correctly here. And now we're going to pass the student's object to our vector using pushback. And here I'm just resetting all of the information for the next line of the file. And the next thing I'm going to show you is that just like before, if you have an array, a vector declared in scope, you can pass it as such without specifying the type or brackets of any type. So that allows you to pass it to another function. Let's look at our menu function that I've put together here. This menu function takes in a vector called people, names, a vector of type people called names. And we're just going to do a couple of operations on our vector using the vector operations. So the first I have here is to print passing scores. So you notice here I'm using the .empty operator to check to see if there's anything actually there. So the .empty will return true or false. It's a Boolean function. So if there is something, at least one element, it will return false. Otherwise, it will return true if that is the case. And so the idea is that we're just going to do a check here to see if we've actually got anything in the vector. Otherwise, we're going to print out what is currently a passing score for the students who took the test. Now, notice that vectors can be accessed at an index just like an array. So you can use brackets on the vector names at I and use the dot operator to access the private variable name associated with that object at that index. And we're doing the same thing here where we're accessing the score of the object stored in the names vector at position I. Let's say we wanted to find the size of the database. The .size operator is a very good way to save the size of your vector as it grows. So vectors can be dynamically grown. You can have a size 10 vector, which can then become an 11, 12, 13 as you start adding in elements without worrying about hitting some hard cap on your size. And so by doing this, by setting an integer equal to names.size, every time that we increase the size, that integer is going to remain the same. It's going to be able to say this is the actual size of the vector. And here, because size is going to return the number of elements in the vector, which in this case is 20, to access the last element at the end of our vector, we would have to do size minus 1. So here I'm doing the same thing where I'm accessing the names vector at some index, which is everything in the brackets, and then I'm using the .name to actually access the private variable associated with that index. So what I'm doing in this is I am printing out the last index in my vector, and then I am using the pop back operation on the vector to remove that element after displaying it. Okay, and say you wanted to resize your vector. Say you wanted to increase the size, or say you wanted to decrease the size. What you can do is you can handily use the resize function, and that's part of the vector library. It takes in some integer, so you're going to have to specify some new size, whether it's larger or smaller than the one you have, and then you'll use that on your vector using the dot operator. And the last thing I want to show you here is how to remove elements from a vector if you need to. There's a couple of ways to do this. The simplest way is to use the names.clear operation. This will remove all elements, any elements whatsoever in the vector from the vector. So once this is called, it literally just returns an empty vector. It'll take care of all of your deletion. Now, you can also use a loop. You can check to see if the size has not reached 0 yet, and then you can use poppack, which is the same function call that we used before in our other case. And here we're just doing it sequentially, each index at a time. So depending on how you want to actually remove elements, there's a couple of ways to do it. The other option, if you're trying to delete something at a particular index, I would use the erase function call, which is also part of the vector library. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at how this runs. So I'm going to go over here and compile through my command line. Okay, so we're going to access and print every passing score first. Notice that here we've got every score in the database. And here we're going to remove a score, remove an entry. So let's remove the last entry. We notice that we've removed Felicia. Felicia was the last element printed here. And now if we were to reprint, William is the last one, so Felicia has been successfully removed from our vector. Okay, say we want to resize. Let's set it as 5. Let's see if we can bring it down. And let's print it again. So notice that we've resized down. The information that we had is no longer in the vector, so it got removed completely. We're only left with the number of elements specified for the size starting at the beginning. So if you had a size 20 vector like I had, and you specified the resize to be 5, it will only keep the first 5 elements in your vector and remove everything after that index. And let's see here, let's also do a clear database. So notice here that the clear operation removes everything right off the bat, and we know that there's nothing left after that operation is performed. Okay, well that's all I've got for today. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I hope this helps with you guys learning vectors.